Around 5 p.m., I was driving down Highway 258 just to go to the store. We have had some recent flooding, so I was driving slower than normal and watching for deer. Along the way, I seen 2 different areas of deer. One had 3 that I could see. The other was at least 6. So on the way back from the store, I knew to slow down in those areas just in case. In one area, it was a rather sharp curve, and I had seen the most deer there. As I came up on the curve, I slowed down, and suddenly, something jumped out in front of my car. I'll call it a he from here out. He seemed to have been running from the pine tree line and took what I would call a leap, out onto the road. Then he was gone. It was only 1, maybe 2 steps on the road to clear the entire road. I had slammed on the brakes and just sat there in awe, wondering if I really had seen what I did. He, or it, was standing on 2 legs, lots of fur, and what I would assume to be at least 8 foot tall. When he jumped in front of the car, he was about a car length in front of me. He looked to have had a large fish in his hand. I know how that sounds, but I swear, it was a long fish. My husband said it may have been a stick, but I'm a country girl, and I know my fish. His quote-unquote fur was longer than what a bear fur would be, and although he was dark brown, it had a reddish hue to it. The headlights gave us a good look at the color as it leapt across the road. There is a lake back behind where he was running, but he also jumped across to the right where those 6+ deer were standing. We are going back at first light to see if he left footprints. It's so muddy that I'm hoping to see some. We hear sounds out here almost nightly of what we describe as Bigfoot sounds, but I've honestly never thought they were out here. It is just sounds you can't describe, so we call it Bigfoot sounds. I've had several friends and family hear them, and one of them will not stay outside long out here because she's heard it so much. When I got home, my husband came to the door to help bring stuff in and ask what was wrong. I said the deer out here are bad, and he asked if I hit one. I said no, and he asked why I was shaking. I didn't realize my whole body was still shaking. I began telling him, and I had tears rolling down, heart pounding, and still shaking so bad. It really shook me up, so much. Not sure what else to say. It was one of the most amazing, yet scariest things I've ever seen. I know I will not sleep tonight, due to thinking about it and what exactly happened. I'm writing this because I think that I might have had a recent experience with a Bigfoot. I live in Springdale, Arkansas. Springdale is not very rugged as far as forest goes, but it can get pretty secluded in the right places. On October 10th, 2002, me and a friend set out on a trip to follow a creek just to see how far it goes, because I followed this creek when I was young. This creek goes through Springdale and winds in through Elm Springs, where there's nothing but dense trees on one side to the left and open fields to the right. Private property. Well, Elm Springs is not a big city, and you would never know the surroundings where I was, not unless you own the property. It was about 5 p.m. when I decided that it was time to try and get out of the creek and up on the bank. We had been walking about 2 hours in and out of the creek, and I decided that we could cover more ground on land before the sun went down. Now, I'm about 5'9", and I guess the creek bed must have been about 7 feet high, so I had my friend C hoist my foot up while I got my knee up high enough to pull myself up. Now, the original plan was to yank him up once on top, but looking back on it now, I realize how foolish this was, because I would have had to been extremely strong, because I probably could have just barely have had touched his fingertips from way up there. But it didn't matter, because what I saw when I got up on my feet scared the crap out of me. The best way to explain it is just to tell you that my heart sunk, and I was extremely stunned. When I got to my feet, I was facing nothing but dense forest or woods. Something caught the corner of my eye, about, let's say, 75 to 100 yards off. Just before getting a good enough look at it, I could tell it was big and brown. Now, I've never seen a bear before out in the wild, so immediately, I started to panic. I took one quick look down and figured I would break every bone in my legs if I were to jump, for the water was maybe only a foot deep. With all of this happening in what I would say just about 2 seconds, and keep in mind, I haven't even been able to warn my friend yet of what I thought would be a charging bear, I looked back to see this thing, or whatever it was, walking extremely fast. It was then I noticed that this couldn't have been a bear. I got a clear look at it for just a second. I'll never forget what I saw that day. I remember its head, real long head. I guess you could say it was shaped kind of like an egg. I just know it wasn't like a human's. The eyes must have been dark because I couldn't make them out. I didn't really notice a nose either, but there was so much hair that it was hard to make out anything except for the head. The biggest thing I'll never forget is the height and weight of this thing. It was so big, legs covered with hair, so massive that it had to be the biggest part of this thing, so wide, it had to have been as wide as a refrigerator. And comparing the legs to my legs, I would have to say that each leg made 2 sets of both of my legs. The shoulders were massive and could have been 3 feet or over from the shoulder to shoulder. I also remember how it walked. Besides taking extremely wide steps, it kind of walked with its front body slightly hunched over. I don't know, like somebody with bad posture. The height of this thing was astronomical. The tip of its head was in the treetops. Now, don't get me wrong, the trees weren't that tall, but they were at least 8 to 9 feet where the limbs started to curl out, and I remember the head was up there with them. There's no way I could have jumped and touched the limbs. They were just so high up. So I put whatever it was that I had seen to be 8 to 9 feet tall. And looking back on it now, the frame could have easily held 500 to 600 pounds. The arms on it looked long, and they swayed back and forth heavily. I don't recall any odor or anything like that, for this thing was out of my view, and I'd say about 5, 6, 7 seconds. Now, I realized when I was getting up the creek bed, I had spooked the thing, because it sure didn't waste no time getting gone into the woods, and I was not about to follow it. So, with all this said, I asked my friend if he had heard anything, which he said no, just because of the running water. And I guess because he was down there, and I just said, "Man, I just seen a monster go into the woods." Of course, my facial features were very solemn and serious, but he still didn't believe me. I repeated this several times to him, and I guess he could tell by looking at my face I was serious. He later said that my face looked white and pale. With his help, I got down back into the creek, but it did take a few minutes, and even then, I wound up falling back in the creek. Luckily, I wasn't hurt, just wet and scared. The sun was setting, and we jogged and trampled our way back, never once darting to go back up on land. We talked and thought better of muttering such foolishness around, for fear of people thinking we were nuts. Truthfully, I don't even think he believes me. But putting myself in his shoes, I probably wouldn't either. But it doesn't matter. I know what I saw. So in closing, I have ruled out the possibility of a hoax. Why would somebody be out in the middle of nowhere in this kind of costume? How would they know we were even coming? And how do you account for the height and size? It was easily a foot taller than any human that I've ever seen. In fact, it was so tall, you can't even duplicate that kind of height. I hope somebody reads this and takes it seriously, because I don't know if I'll ever go into the woods again after this. At around 9 p.m. at night, I was standing outside my house in rural Washington County, Arkansas, right near the Madison County border. While standing there in the yard, I heard a noise from the woods north of my yard. 16 acres of my entire 24 acres of property were thickly wooded. It sounded like a hooting, a deep-throated howl coming from the tree line. This noise occurred about 3 times within a 15-second time frame. At the time, my wife had just left the property about 2 weeks prior, and I briefly considered the noise to be made by my grandfather, who happened to live next door. I shouted toward the tree line, "Hey, that's a good way for an old man to get shot." Afterwards, the hooting howl occurred twice more. My dogs, which are 2 coonhounds, a rat terrier, and a shepherd mutt, all bolted from the porch and headed to the tree line, barking and growling, as if they saw something. I ran to the house and grabbed my .22. Running out the front door and angling west along the tree line, I noticed my dogs dogging something along the woodline, with the brush and tree limbs thrashing about. I followed this thrashing line of brush, approximately 1,500 along the woodline in the pasture behind my house. As I tramped along, I realized that my dogs were still barking vehemently, yet they were still in the confines of the yard. I was alone along the tree line, with my brush thrashing guest in the dark. I paused and observed the continued limb thrashing progressing toward the west of the property. Also, during this run, I could hear thumping footsteps, as if somebody were wearing heavy boots. In some realization of my potential vulnerability, I returned to my house, whereupon I immediately phoned my next-door grandparents. My grandmother answered the phone. I just told her that was really funny, and she asked me what. I told her of my theory of my granddad hiding in the woods, just to scare me. She just told me, "Well, he's sitting right here. He ain't been out all night." Indeed, I spoke with him, and he certainly did not have the time to make it back to the house and decrease his rate of breath, 75 years of age within that time frame. I believe that I walked out of the house and disturbed an exploring Sasquatch. Who knows what it could have really been?